thank you to you for having been a real driver of making this evening happen. Um, I feel really passionately about what we've been able to produce for everybody this evening, and the opportunity we have not just to share memories of that horrific dark time of the Holocaust, but also consider how people were able to recover and rehabilitate following that time. And this year in particular, where we've used the word unprecedented so in an unprecedented number of times, it is a year whereby we are so concerned about what it means to achieve rehabilitation and recovery, because so many people have felt their own personal suffering and pain, not to make a comparison of the extent of pain and suffering from one to the other, but nevertheless just to notice that many people are thinking about what it means to rehabilitate and to recover at this time. And so I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by Mala and Tom for what promises to be a very inspiring evening of not just the Holocaust in terms of its recollection, but also in terms of how it is represented and how it continues to echo through the narratives of our lives, not just as a time of darkness, but also as a source for triggering us and empowering us to push ahead with moving forward into a happier and more hope-filled future. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our lovely member, Mala Tribich. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mala's background, and I also want to say a couple of personal words about my relationship with Mala. So Mala was born as Mala Helfgott in 1930 in Poland. And Mala will tell us today about her experiences during the Holocaust as a hidden child, surviving life in the ghetto and several concentration camps, and about her life after the Holocaust. She came to the UK in 1947 and married Maurice Tribich a few years later in 1950. Whilst her children were growing up, Mala gained a degree in sociology from the University of London. Mala is an active member of Barnet Synagogue. Mala regularly speaks about her experiences in the Holocaust to audiences all around the country, including at the Scottish Ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day earlier this week, and at an event with Tom for the National Literacy Trust. Mala has also been a regular speaker for March of the Living UK, returning to Poland with groups of students and young adults. And not only that, but Mala is a firm family friend of the Newton part of my family, which is my mother's part of the family, because and this I only realized when Shoshana and the family and us we were hosted by the Cohens, by Donna and Tony, one Shabbat early on in our time in the community, and Mala was there as a guest as well. And Mala said that she was a survivor and that she'd gone through the war. And I said, well, do you know my grandparents? Maybe you know about them. Have you heard of the group, the Boys? And the person sitting next to Mala said, oh, what do you mean? Mala's one of the boys. I said, what's going on? I said, I know your face. 1 second. You look like Ben. You look like Uncle Ben. And it turned out that yes, that there sitting in front of me was Ben Helfgott, Uncle Ben Helfgott's sister, that Mala and Ben both survivors of the Holocaust, and Ben was one of those survivors who made his way or was taken after the war from Theresienstadt on RAF bomber planes over to England when England accepted 1,000 child survivor refugees to offer to home them and to somewhat rehabilitate them. And that together with Ben on those planes coming over to Windermere were also two other young people amongst the 300 that went to Windermere from that group of 1,000. One was called Benny Neustatter and the other one was called Salah Hochspiegel. And Benny and Salah, Neustatter soon became Newton as he made his way into British society. Those are my maternal grandparents. Grandpa Benny is no longer alive, but Grandma Salah may even be on this call right now. And I know I spoke to her earlier this evening. She lives in Netanya, and that was always a dream of hers at one point in her life to go and live in our promised land. And that is where our connection, I think, to Mala is. And so as soon as we made that connection over the Shabbos meal, Mala, we started chatting away, and you remembered my auntie's names and my mother's name and all the different parts of our the details of our family. And so I am so delighted to introduce you and to hand over to you as you're going to address us this evening.
Well, thank you very much for that amazing introduction. It's absolutely new to me, not the introduction. I mean, I was familiar with everything you said, but I've never had an introduction like that. Also, I have never had quite this format, because I always speak about my, you know, what I went through during the war, my experiences. And I thought, well, I almost can't speak about anything, but the way you've introduced it, Rabbi, it actually quite appeals to me. It'd be nice to speak about what happened after the war. So where do I start? This really is a first. You have heard a little bit about my background. And yet I was one of 3 children, and luckily my brother survived. And we are the only 2 survivors of our families, of our family. So I was liberated in Bergen-Belsen, and I'm telling you this, so it gives me an opportunity to pay tribute to the wonderful British forces, to the army, because, well, they were the first people when the war finished to treat us like human beings. After 5.5 years of being treated like, I don't know how to describe it, like vermin, like some people or something that no one cared about. And when the liberation came, I'm often asked, well, what was it like when you were liberated? It must have been a wonderful feeling. But in fact, we didn't quite behave like, say, the people in England, because I've heard about and I know how the parties in the street and everyone was celebrating. It wasn't like that in Belsen. For those of us who survived, that in itself was okay, but we didn't know who else survived in the family. And so we were still a bit distraught, concerned, upset. It took quite a while before people managed to trace one another. And I was actually ill when the war finished. I was down with typhus. And I was transferred to a hospital after 2 days. They had a terrible job on their hands to create hospitals out of nothing. Most of the people were ill. There were very few people who were able to walk or look after themselves. But it's also amazing how quickly some people made the recovery very quickly. Because if I tell you that we had a theater going, it was a big tent, but it was within 3 months of the end of the war. There was a theater, there were various activities going. It was quite amazing how those people who did survive and weren't ill were able to immediately take part in normal life. It was far from normal, but compared with what we had before, it was just amazing. So I was actually looking after my little cousin whose mother had been deported, a Helfgott cousin. And I had 2 stories of cousins, one good and one absolutely tragic. Because I was living at one point during the deportations with a Christian family on false papers. I was supposed to be Christian, together with my cousin who was a year younger. I was 12 and she was 11. And my cousin, Ija, disappeared without trace. It's quite a longish story, so I won't start, but it's something that stayed with me. And as time goes on, I feel it even more deeply than I did at the time, because too much going on then. And then I acquired another cousin, my little cousin, who was only 5, and her mother was deported, and I was looking after her. So for 2 years, she was with me. And again, we miraculously survived. And then when the war finished, I actually had typhus. I was down with typhus, and I was transferred to a hospital. And within 3 months of the end of the war, we were liberated in April, and we were actually sent to Sweden. It's, when I say we, the children, some of the children, not all of them, but it's a group of us, and I don't know the numbers, but it could be as many as maybe 200, were sent by boat to Sweden, because Sweden opened their gates for refugees and anybody who wanted to come, and they were particularly good to children. We arrived there, and because it was July, it was summer holidays for schools, we were sent to resort places. I mean, they weren't luxurious places, but they were near lakes, and we had all sorts of activities. We went swimming, and it was absolutely wonderful. The Swedes were really good to us. And you know, the contrast with what had preceded it was so very, still very present with us. But the children after the war, the Jewish children who survived, the Jewish agency and the Zionist organization had plans for us, because they wanted us to go and settle, especially all the orphans. They wanted them to settle in Palestine, what was then Palestine. And therefore, when the holidays finished and you know, children went back to school, they set up a school for us, a kind of boarding school, where we were taught all the general subjects, but quite a bit about Jewish history and the background to sort of Palestine and how in Zionism and so on. And I still didn't know whether anybody of I knew what had happened to my mother and sister. They had a most tragic death. But I still didn't know what happened to my father and brother. And then eventually we made contact, well, Ben made contact. And everybody's asking me, well, how did you find one another? And I actually asked Ben, because he's always had a fantastic memory. And he was also always very enterprising. So he went straight back to Poland after the war. As soon as the war finished, they were liberated. And traveling in Europe after the war was chaotic, because the trains didn't run, and sometimes they did, and sometimes they would stop for hours. But he made his way back to Poland, and he had the most terrible experience. He nearly lost his life, but he arrived in Piotrków, my hometown, and he met somebody. Of course, there's no one of our family left, but the other families that he knew. But he met somebody who saw me after the war in Belsen. I mean, the after the war was very significant, because during the war wouldn't have meant anything. So he knew that I had survived. But it was quite a long time before I knew he had survived. And eventually we started corresponding. And a lot of the correspondence actually came from Windermere. So Windermere is very significant in my life. And after some time, it was decided when they discovered in England that Ben's sister survived, it was their decision that I should come to London to be reunited with him, or to England anyway, to be reunited, and not the other way around. And I have to say, whatever I did after the war, it was not necessarily my decision. All the decisions were made for me, and I just followed. But I have to say that all the decisions were really right. They all worked for me. And I was just very lucky. I've been very, very lucky throughout, very lucky to survive. Because I was with my mother and sister, and I should have been with them. But we won't go into that. So I came to England in 1947. I had left all my friends behind, and now I had new friends. But because my brother Ben was always so popular, and he had a particularly sort of a group of friends that were closer. He knew everybody, he was friendly with everybody, but there were a few that they sort of considered themselves brothers. These boys really treated me like a sister, and they used to sort of occasionally take me out for the day, and that was all very nice. But nevertheless, I had to get used to a group of new people whom I didn't know, whereas they all came together, they knew one another, but they were very friendly. And I really have no complaints about anything in England when I came here. But I came under the auspices of the Central British Fund, as it was then, which is now the World Jewish Relief. And that organization was wonderful. We all had sort of individual attention. People lived in different lodgings, and some lived in hostels, but we weren't in any way regimented. They've all very seriously discussed with people what they wanted to do, how they wanted to go on with life, anybody needed any help. And they found me room temporarily, because the girl that was occupying that room, it had been in hospital, and she was, in those days, people always went on, what the word is called now, but they never sort of went straight home. They had to have a sort of resting period after an operation. And they said, you use her room, and when she comes back, by then we'll find you another room. But there was a couch in that room as well. And when she got back, I occupied the couch, and she had her back, and it all worked out. Had two brothers lived next door in a room, and they're a very nice family. My post-war life wasn't particularly exciting and interesting, but I have to say, my first priority when I came here was to learn the language and find a job to be able to support myself. And this committee sponsored me to go to, well, I learned the language very quickly. I went to a place called English for Foreigners. It's very imaginative sort of title. And I learned the language within very few weeks. I can't remember how long, but it was really only a matter of perhaps 3 or 4 weeks. I learned enough to be able to start college, so that a secretarial college. I was there for just about a year, a little less. And after that, I started work. My first job, I was earning £4 a week, and I lived on that. It sounds impossible now, but it was possible. It wasn't a luxurious existence, but I didn't complain. But in between, when I first came and while I was still studying, I did have a social life. And in those days, the things we liked doing most, and most of us did, was going to dances. I mean, that was quite a sort of usual kind of recreation, going to a dance at the weekend. And during the week, I did belong to various clubs and organizations. One of the first ones I joined was Habonim. If any of you know about Habonim, it's very popular. I go on the March of the Living these days, but it's another subject. And I am always with the young people, the students, usually students and movements. And one day there was someone asked me, so what did you do when you first came to England? I said, well, the first thing I did was to join Habonim. Well, they were so excited over it, because it is a very well-known movement, and among young people, it's really great. I became really one of them. And I also, I used to get the odd date, and fellows used to ask me out. I used to go to dances. I used to go to clubs, and I had just the ordinary type of life that young people had in those days. And I got married very young. When I met my husband-to-be, I was only 19. Well, I wasn't 19 yet. I was still 18. And when we got married, I was 19. So I started married life quite early. Not for those days. People used to get married much earlier, because it's very different today. But I really got into the sort of rhythm of the sort of typical English Jewish family. We belong to our shul, Poets Road, if any of you know it, in Highbury. And neither of us had any money, because my husband he served for 5.5 years in the army, in Royal Engineers. And when he was demobbed, he still had to finish his studies, because he started architecture before the war, but then he had to interrupt it halfway through. So when he was demobbed, he still had to study. But by the time we got married, his studies were finished and he was working. And we gradually built a home, and we had a family. I have a daughter and a son. And really, that's my post-war life. But because I am talking about that for the first time to a group of people, this is all I can think of. If I was giving, because things sort of come to mind all along as time goes on. So I will now, open it to questions that you'd like to ask, because things I haven't thought of telling you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mala. I think what we'll do is we'll invite Tom to speak next. And if anybody thinks of questions, please pop them in the chat. Questions for Mala or Tom or Rabbi Landau, and then we'll do all the questions together. So you will have a chance to ask Mala questions. Thank you. I'll hand back to Rabbi Landau to introduce our next speaker, Tom. Thank you, Mala.
Thank you so much, Mala. It was so beautiful to hear those words and to hear a story of how you had to rebuild your life and what that meant to you and the different stages that that took. It's almost like piecing together the fragments and making something beautiful. And you look beautiful tonight, Mala. So I just want to say that in front of everyone. I told you when you came in, and you look glamorous and lovely. And it's a real privilege to have you here addressing us. I'm just going to also share some words about Tom, who's joining us this evening. I'm going to just also add Tom to the pins. Fine. So Tom is a father, husband, author, football fan, and a reader. He wasn't actually keen on reading when he was young, but his mum encouraged him to read about football in newspapers, magazines, and books. Gradually, he came to love books, and he went on to do A-levels at 21, and then he did a degree in European literature. After he had graduated, he went to work in a bookshop, then a library, then managed book festivals. All that time, he was writing stories, poems, diaries, and books for adults. Then, after a few years, he was lucky enough to have a football book for children accepted by Puffin. He has written many, many books about football, rugby, spies, history, crime, ghosts, and has won many, many awards for his books. His latest book, After the War, has been nominated for many awards and was selected as one of the Daily Telegraph's Children's Books of the Year 2020. Tom has been working with many organizations, including UCL, the National Literacy Trust, and Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, to ensure that children learn about the Holocaust, about what happened after the war, and we're delighted to have him with us this evening. And I just wanted to share how I met Tom for the first time. It's because Tom sent out some emails sharing with the wider Jewish community his new book, After the War, which you can see on the poster behind Tom's head. And in sort of, Tom sent out expressions of interest to people, and I responded as soon as I saw Tom's book. I said, I'd love to find out more about your book, and you know what, I've got a personal story to share with you. And that is like, maybe a few minutes later, Tom responded, and he made me feel very good. He said I'd made his day, that I'd responded and shared that we have that connection. And then post a few days later, I got some introductory readers. I got a copy of Tom's book, which is a really beautiful story of after the war, story of the Windermere children, which is so accessible for young people to read. And what I think is marvelous is that young people nowadays almost, it's a scary thing that many young people don't know very much about the Holocaust at all. In our previous synagogue in South London, in Kingston upon Thames, we used to do school visits where local non-Jewish schools would come to the synagogue as part of their religious education. And this was often the first time that some of these young people would meet a Jew. And there was all sorts of questions that they would ask. One of my predecessors got asked whether his skull cap hit his horns, right? Whether we keep our horns under here. And that's because that's what they understood about Jews. But by and large, many of these young people also don't know very much about the Holocaust, and it's not necessarily part of their fundamental education. So I'm delighted that Tom has been able to produce a work that is not only exciting to read, but is also something that will ensure that future generations, both Jews and non-Jews, will be able to understand what this stain on history meant and how these young people who we are seeing embodied in front of us in the form of Mala and others who are on the call tonight were able to rebuild their lives after the war. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Landau. Thank you very much to you and Rachel for having me on this evening as part of this event. And yes, my name's Tom Palmer, and I'm a children's author, and I've written sports books and history books, and my most recent book is After the War, which is the story of the Windermere children. I thought it'd be useful tonight just to speak a bit about how I went about writing the book, how I researched it, and how I made sure, being someone who knew something about the Holocaust, but by no means a lot about the Holocaust, how I could write a book about that subject, particularly for children. I think, and so well, it began with my wife, as many things do in my career. It began with, she was listening to a radio program, Open Country, on Radio 4 about the Windermere children. And we've been thinking about what the next book could be that I should write. And she said, you've got to listen to this, you've got to listen to it. Because she knew as well that I love the Lake District. I've been on holiday there every year of my life. And it's an important place to me. So I listened to the radio program, which you can still listen to on iPlayer. I believe if you look up Open Country and Windermere Boys, it should on iPlayer, you should be able to find it. So I listened to the radio program, and I was fascinated. And the radio program, one of the people interviewed on the radio program was Trevor Avery, and he is very, very much involved with the Lake District Holocaust Project. And the Lake District Holocaust Project is a charity that tries to tell the story of the Windermere children, so that more people can find out about the story and find out about the Holocaust, but also they use the story to fight intolerance and an understanding of how to make the world a better place. And they have in Windermere Library, there is an exhibition about the Windermere children, and also there's a website and it is ldhp.org.uk. And so I went on the website, and on the website there's an astonishing amount of recordings and some video footage of the boys and girls from the Windermere children. And I was able to listen to, it must be 100+ hours of interviews with them about their experiences, and they spoke about coming from, particularly being liberated in Theresienstadt, and then coming a few months later to Windermere, and brought on RAF Sterling bombers, coming to Windermere, where they lived for 4 or 5 months before they dispersed to other places in the UK, but also other countries like the US and Israel, etc. And I found that really interesting, and I thought, I want to write the book, but I didn't, to be quite honest, I didn't dare write it. Who am I to write the story of Holocaust survivors? But I realised that somebody has to, and my job as a children's writer is to write about things that I am passionate about, things that I want children to know about, also things that I think children will want to know about as well. So my first thing to do was to go and meet Trevor Avery, and he very generously met me in Windermere, and we went for a coffee and a walk, and I talked about some of the books I'd written, and how I wanted to write a story about the Windermere boys. And he was, I think he was vetting me, and I think he does vet people to make sure that the right people are taking on a story that he's invested a lot of his life in with his colleague Rose. So I decided that I would write the book, but very much with Trevor's help, and then began the research process. So as well as listening to the recordings on the Lake District Holocaust Project website, as well as interviewing, meeting some of the boys and going to some of their talks. I went to see Eric Hirsch do a talk, Ike Alterman, and also Mala. I went to see them speak. I read books as well. So I read, this is the sort of big work on the boys, the Windermere children, and the ones who went to Southampton and other parts of the UK, and that was a really useful starting point. And I mean, along this book and Trevor were like the root of all the sources that I then went to after that. And then I also read these two books, among others, the story by Michael Friedland about Ben Helfgott, and also Eric Hirsch's book, and he was also involved in a film. And I immersed myself in everything I could possibly find about the Windermere children to try to understand it. And that's when I write about history. So I've done books about D-Day, and I've done books about the armistice. I try to immerse myself as much as I can to find out as much as I can. So, and in doing that, I gathered a lot of notes. So I keep a notebook, and I gather lots of notes that can help me write the story. And I also keep a scrapbook. I find that a combination of keeping a notebook and a scrapbook is a really good way for me to gather all my thoughts, to know what I'm going to write the story, how I'm going to write a story, with all the way with the help of Trevor. So this is my scrapbook, and when I'm trying to develop characters and settings, a scrapbook's really useful, because notes are great, but you can't really, well, through my notes anyway, you can't really see what you want to see. So I'll gather pictures of, for instance, some of the boys. This is a picture, sorry, the light's doing a bit weird. I'll also gather images of the places that they came to live, and also maps as well, having read and listened to the testimonies of the Windermere children, and always making sure that I use primary sources. I put a map of Windermere in. I'm afraid the focus isn't great, but you can see the blue bit, which is the lake. That's the Calgarth estate where the Windermere children went to stay when they arrived in England. That's where they used to go swimming. That's the town that they might have gone shopping in. That's one of the hills they used to climb up, maybe on a clear night, to look at the stars. And I gathered all that information and got it all together so that I had everything I could possibly need to decide what to go in the book. And that was another place and time that Trevor really helped me, Trevor Avery, because it was important that I chose the right things to put in the book. And I wouldn't have had the confidence to write this book without Trevor's help, because what Trevor did was he spent years, I believe it's 15 years, like immersing himself in the story of the Windermere boys, the Windermere children, and trying to tell this story to other people. And for me, his experience and understanding of the right way and not the wrong way to write about the Holocaust was really important, giving me the sort of scaffolding to allow me to try and write my story. So for instance, in an early-ish draft of this, I tried to make every scene, I tried to make it based on the testimony, but there was 2 or 3 scenes that I put in that they felt, if I just embellish that a bit and make this scene, that'll make the story, even better, work better as a story. And they were the 2 or 3 scenes that Trevor said I would reconsider putting these scenes in, because I'd invented things. And Trevor made it very clear to me that there were books and there were films and TV shows that take the story of the Holocaust and corrupt it, I suppose, and tell it in a way which isn't true. And Trevor made it very clear to me that it was important that every scene in here, which there are, is based on the testimony of a survivor. Any scene in here, I could tell you what the source was from a book, or from recordings, or from videos that I have watched. And Trevor made it clear that I needed to make sure that I did that, because he felt that, and correctly, that if you make things up, a Holocaust denier could they could come and say, well, where did you get that story from? And if I said I made it up, the denier could use that to deny everything in my book. So I was very careful to make sure it was all based on primary sources. But another primary source I was very fortunate to meet a person was a lady called Joyce. So Joyce, when the Windermere children arrived in England, they lived on the Calgarth estate, and the Calgarth estate was, as many of you know, was used to be the places where the men who made the aeroplanes, the engineers who made the flying boats, which they tested on Lake Windermere. That's where they lived, but the war was over and they'd gone back to the places that they'd come before. And on that estate, there were some local people. For instance, there was a family who had been bombed out of Liverpool, a British family from Liverpool, who'd come to live by Lake Windermere because they had nowhere else to live. And for other reasons, they came to live in these houses, which had been vacated by the engineers who were building the aeroplanes. And one of those families is here. And they were really, this was a very useful story to me, because this is Joyce here. And she was a girl, I think she was about roughly 8 years old when the Windermere children arrived from Theresienstadt. And that's her dog Spot. And they are characters, and other members of their family are characters in my story, because in the same way I've met Eric Hirsch in person and read his book and read other survivors' books, I've had their stories. I've also had the story about what it was like for those people who lived in that area when the Windermere children came. And I've been very lucky because I've got to meet Joyce. This is Joyce now, or a couple of years ago. And she and her family have told me lots of stories about what happened when the Windermere children came. And that was very useful to me, because I was able to gather lots of stories that would hopefully make my book feel realistic, feel authentic, but also be spot on and based on primary sources. So they were the pieces that I sort of wanted to put into the jigsaw of the story. When I write, I always do a plan, and this, for anyone interested in writing and planning, this is the plan for after the war. And I can't actually hold the whole thing. Basically each blue post-it note, sorry, it's a bit blurry, is a scene based on a testimony of one of the Windermere children or Joyce's family that I've used to write the story. And in doing this, I was able to put all the scenes and decide which scene I should keep in, which scene I shouldn't keep in, but also what order I should put them in. And I spent about a week on this plan, making sure it's all in the right order. Then again, I tested it with Trevor. So I ran it by Trevor Avery. I asked him what he thought, and we found a plan that would work and would make sense as a story. So, and as well as that, after I'd written the first and second draft, I went to Auschwitz, I went to Krakow, the old Jewish quarter, I went to Theresienstadt, and I did some research in Amsterdam as well, and tried to get everything I could so that this book felt authentic. And with Trevor's guidance, I really felt like I could be as confident as I could be that I was telling the story from the point of view of those who the story is about, which, as all of you sitting there watching know, is really, really important. But I also had to consider who was going to be reading the book, because I write for children, and the Holocaust is a very difficult subject to write for children. And this is very much a book for 10-year-olds and older. I certainly wouldn't give it to anyone younger than that. So sort of year 6, maybe some year 5s, but perhaps with guidance. I wanted to get this right, and Trevor wanted to get this right as well. And I was very lucky. I had a relationship with Grasmere Primary School, which is just a few miles away from where the Windermere boys came to live when they came to England. And Trevor and I went to Grasmere Primary with a latest draft of this, and we showed it to the children. And most of them were year 6, there were some year 5s, and the teachers there had selected the children who were the most sort of able to deal with the subjects and would be able to give us good feedback on the book. And we felt that was really important, because I've written books about parachuting dogs in the Second World War. I've written books about girls who are footballers, and I can be pretty sure where to judge it, so that the children enjoy it, are engaged with the story, but not traumatized by the story. But after the war, I wasn't sure. And so we went to Grasmere Primary School, and the children read it, and the teachers and their head teacher as well. And that was a really important point. And if you know Trevor, I'm sure he would tell you about it as well. The children were very keen to understand. And going back to what Rabbi Landau said earlier, it's really important that children do understand what happened during the Holocaust to a certain extent, to a certain degree. And they felt that in the book, the draft that they read, that I'd hidden some things which maybe I didn't need to hide, and that I'd tried to create emotion in the storylines where it would be better if I just told the truth and told facts about what had happened. And so that was ever so useful. And I went back with Trevor's help, and I rewrote the book so that it did explain to the children what a death march was, what a concentration camp was to some extent, and also what a ghetto was, so that it was very clear to the children what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and what particularly happened to the Windermere children. So after all that process, I felt like I'd done my best, and it sort of shows to me that one person doesn't write a book on their own. I've had the help of dozens of people, adults, historians, some of the survivors, and the children and teachers, to make sure that this book is right, because I did feel very much that it was important that I did get it right, and that it worked both for the people who the story is about and for who the story is for. And going back to Trevor, I know he's watching this, so I'd just like to thank him again for all the guidance and help that he gave me, and being the one who has been done so much to in the north of England to tell the story of the Windermere children, so that we all understand the history, but also it helps us to make a better future. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now. It's probably time for me to stop.
Tom, that was great. You mentioned you might read to us a tiny bit.
Did I? Right. Okay, I shall. Just a short sort of 2 or 3 minute bit. Excellent. Yep. Right. I'll read from the beginning, and I don't have to make a decision. So. Even though he was afraid, Yossi forced himself to crawl to the window in the side of the aeroplane. Oh, I should explain the story. I created 3 composite characters, and I used the testimony of lots of different of the boys, and sort of made sort of composite characters. So none of the characters are the actual characters, but if you read the book, you'd recognize the stories of Eric Hirsch, Ike Alterman, Sir Ben Helfgott, etc. I'll start again. Even though he was afraid, Yossi forced himself to crawl to the window in the side of the aeroplane. There were no seats, so he had to crouch on all fours as he and the other passengers were thrown about by the turbulence. Outside, he could see a wall of white and a wing wobbling so hard it looked like it might fall off. Behind him, Yossi heard children cry out, the sound of at least one person being sick, and some laughter too. "Come and sit down here, Yossi," a woman's voice called out. Yossi did as he was told, scrambling along the floor of the Sterling bomber to rejoin the other children and adults sitting on blankets. Yossi loved airplanes. He should have been scared at them, as the first time he'd seen one 6 years ago at the beginning of the war, a German bomber had tried to destroy his hometown in Poland. Then, over the following years, he'd seen bombs falling from British and American airplanes, targeting the factories where he was forced to work. He still loved planes, perhaps because he knew they were a sign that change was coming. And once he was in the concentration camps, Yossi was desperate for change. And so that's the beginning of the story, and that's based on the Sterling bombers as they're coming into land at Carlisle Airport. And there is some footage of many of you have probably seen it, of some of the Windermere children getting onto the Sterling bombers in Prague when they're about to fly off to England. That's if you check the Imperial War Museum website, you can see that, and that's good to see.
Thank you so much, Tom, for reading and for that really fascinating and detailed explanation of how you wrote the story.
Thanks,
really, really interesting. I'd now like to introduce our third speaker for the evening, who is known to most of us on the call, Rabbi Landau. Rabbi Landau was born and raised in London. He holds a professional doctorate in clinical psychology and he has special interests in mindfulness meditation, which those of us that have been following Rabbi Landau's YouTube outputs all know already. And he's interested in the interaction between psychological processes and Torah content. Together with his wife Shoshana, Rabbi Landau has held a number of positions in the community in England, and we're very lucky and privileged that he is currently the rabbi of Barnet. Going to hand over to Rabbi Landau to share some of his own thoughts and reflections, but please may I encourage everybody to put questions in the chat for Mala, for Tom, and for Rabbi Landau. And after Rabbi Landau has finished speaking, myself and Rabbi Landau will start sharing the questions. So thank you very much, and over to you, Rabbi Landau.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that introduction. And also thank you, Tom, for that amazing just personal journey into a story that many of us have grown up with, but that you had to make your own and sort of inculcate into almost your method for this long period of time, and the constant iterations of and drafts shows, I think, for me, I was just struck by the responsibility that you took to make this an authentic and meaningful experience, and all those different parts, making it authentic, making it accessible to kids. Those two things together it's just very inspiring, Tom, to hear that. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
I feel slightly imposterish on this call this evening, but maybe not. So the other part of the bio that Rachel didn't include, but is I think relevant for tonight, is that my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. So my maternal grandparents are both Polish Jews. My grandmother coming from Lodz, my grandfather coming from a place called Skarżysko. My paternal grandparents are also European Jews. My father's father, some of you might have met him one time if you ever holidayed in Margate or Cliftonville. My grandfather was the rabbi there, and he was a Jew from Czechoslovakia who came over just before the war started. And my father's mother, she was a German Jewess from Leipzig who came over on the Kindertransport. So there's a lot of European and post-war narrative in my family, and actually on both sides of my family there's this post-war narrative. And I first started thinking about this not just from a family perspective, but almost from an academic perspective when I was doing my undergraduate degree in UCL. And one of the requirements in UCL was not just to take courses within your particular subject area, but also to take one or two other courses from anywhere else in the university. And so whilst I was taking most of my courses in psychology, I was also really interested in some of the courses offered by the Hebrew and Jewish Studies department. And one of the courses there was the Holocaust Witnessed, Represented and Remembered. And it talked about the different ways that the Holocaust has been communicated since the early time through till the current day, and how actually as time has progressed from those initial years, those post-war years, so we are also changing in the way that we are representing our Holocaust material. I should just mention, by the way, apologies for the the damaged face. It was a bike accident this morning. I hope it's not too off-putting. Anyway, so thank God I'm okay. So one of the things that course sort of alerted me to, and actually you'll see this as a scene in the Windermere children, is that some of these boys, they're standing in the woods and they're realizing that they were all on the same train on the way to Buchenwald. And that was the train that got stopped as it was liberated before it reached the camp. And they look at each other, these three boys, and they realize that they never recognized each other from that time, because at that time they were so malnourished and so sick and broken that what they looked like then compared to what they look like now was absolutely different. And they say to each other, if we couldn't even recognize each other, we went through this, the whole world, they're never going to believe what we went through. No one could believe this insanity actually happened. And so the initial representations, or the initial method of transmitting Holocaust information was through direct survivor testimony. that was those flurry of books, the Primo Levis, the Viktor Frankls, the people who just told us about what happened and gave some processing, but really told us about what happened. The diaries, the Marchaminkos, the different things, telling us about what was going on at that time and the build-up into the Shoah. And then as time has progressed, we've moved on to different types of representations till you get a few years ago, a Quentin Tarantino movie using the Holocaust as its theme, but changing course into an entirely unexpected sort of alternate universe, alternate ending. And that's another way to also represent the Holocaust. And so when I'm looking at what we have tonight, we have Mala on the one hand, a living survivor of the Holocaust, and Tom on the other, someone who's trying to communicate and represent the Holocaust to the next generation. I'm seeing that bridge across 75 years and more of lived history with a desperate need to remember. And I'm I feel a little bit caught in between those two tensions, because on the one hand, I feel a personal link as the third generation survivor of European Jews, of survivors of the Holocaust, but also a mouthpiece for the future as someone who will also, I hope, take part in this initiative and these endeavors that Rachel was also such a part of in her professional work, working for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust to communicate not just to the Jewish community, but also to the larger non-Jewish community, what these times were about. So just a few words about spanning those two parts, the family narrative on the one hand and what it means to me in terms of the future on the other. So I think growing up, we always sort of knew that our family had a special story. And I've spoken to my mum about this, and so my mum's a second generation survivor. I'm a third, and actually a lot of work has gone into thinking about intergenerational trauma or intergenerational experiences. And so my mum and my grandmother remember that when my mum was growing up, so my grandma came out an orphaned girl. She had a brother who'd survived and gone to America, but essentially there was no family. And yet there was family. There was hundreds of members of the family, because all those boys, the boys as they were affectionately called, and as Tom reminded us, they're not just boys, but they're also girls, those group of survivors became family. And Mala alluded to that as well when she talked about Uncle Ben's sort of network of friends who were like brothers. They'd survived together, they'd come over together. My grandfather had people who had nursed him to health in the bunks of Birkenau, who had been with him, and now they were here in the United Kingdom making their new life together. And so these were my mother's uncles and aunties as she was growing up. These were her family. And I grew up with my great uncles, great Uncle Michael, Uncle Alec, Uncle Ben, like all these people who were part of our family story and our family narrative. And so that was my extended family too. We had our blood cousins in terms of my parents' siblings and cousins, and we had our Holocaust cousins, or our boys' cousins, our 45A Society cousins, who also form part of that narrative. And we'd get presents at Hanukkah from these people, and we'd go to their houses and we'd take part in their simchas and their joyous occasions. And that's what it meant to be a family of survivors. There are also other parts to being part of this family that weren't necessarily just about extended connection. I remember when we used to go to my grandma, and whenever we do go to my grandmother's apartment in Netanya in Israel, the fridge is always full. And it used to be the case that every week she would throw out heaps of food because there was just too much for any person to eat, no matter how many guests my Yiddish grandmother was inviting over. There was always too much food. But I suppose once you've known hunger, like a person who's gone through the camps has known hunger, you're always going to have a fridge which is absolutely filled to bursting with food. And food actually became quite a strong narrative within our family. So you can't help but go into grandmother's house, and she forces food upon you. And actually it got to the extent that when I was studying in yeshiva in Israel, so I was studying in an institution which was about 50 miles, maybe 40 miles from my grandmother's apartment, and she used to mail me in the post. She used to mail me in Israeli post these massive cakes that would come to the yeshiva, and like everyone would know that Samuel's got a cake, because there would be too much to distribute, and it's coming through the Middle Eastern sun, so you can't, it doesn't last very long. But my grandmother, week in, week out, she would make this massive cake and mail it down to her grandson in the south of Israel, southern part of Israel, to give him some food. And I spoke to my grandmother this afternoon before coming on this evening, and I asked her, what would you want me to share with people about what it means for you to have survived? And she said, I just want to talk about my family. I want to talk about my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. And Kane Ironhara, she is now a matriarch of a very large and ever increasing family, and her pride and her joy comes in the fact that not only has she survived, but she has Jewish children, Jewish grandchildren, Jewish great-grandchildren, and she has seen her legacy continue. But I suppose the other thought about that is that that's a double-edged sword, not for her, but for the recipients of that pride, because there's a certain pressure being the child or grandchild of a survivor. There's a pressure to make sure that grandmother's proud. There's a pressure to make sure that mum is proud, because how could you not make sure that mum is proud? And I know that there's a little bit of a drive and a pressure within me that isn't just my own, but that's a family story of having to excel, needing to excel. And the way my mum spoke about it when I spoke to her on the phone earlier about it was the importance, for example, of education, because that was something that was ripped away from my grandparents, a childhood that was ripped away, an education that was ripped away, something that they had to struggle for, that my grandmother had to matriculate when she came and was part of the Windermere children, and she had to struggle to become a state-registered nurse. That was something that was so important, was that if this was something that we had to struggle for and work for, so too, let's make sure that my children, my grandchildren, that's something which is so important. So education, and not just education, but also an ethos surrounding their education, an ethos of caring for others. And so I don't think it's by chance that my mother's a doctor and I'm a psychologist and a rabbi, and that these are things that sort of go, and my brother's a dentist. These are stories that trickle through the family narrative of taking responsibility for others in a way that others didn't take responsibility for you. And so my grandmother was a nurse, and my grandfather owned old age homes, and he was always so careful with his money to help other people and to give to other people. And so that push to make a better future is definitely something that is felt within the family too. That's the story that we receive. What about what we do with that story in terms of what we position to the others? I've already started talking about giving in the terms of care, but I think in terms of me being a rabbi, sometimes people ask, why are you a rabbi? And this was a question that was asked actually in the job interview for Barnet Shul. What is it that drives you to be a rabbi? And this was actually the first time I think that Rachel and I had a sort of a connection. Was I had brought with me to the job interview a little envelope, and in that envelope, which I don't have with me here now, it would have been better to have it, but in that envelope was a little cloth patch about this size, which had on it the letter KL, Konzentrationslager, concentration camp. It had in big letters, big numbers, the number that my grandfather wore on his uniform, which was his number, and on the bottom Buchenwald. And alongside that was a cloth piece, a yellow cloth piece, a star emblazoned with the word Judah. And I said, and I handed it around, and I gave it to Rachel, and this was, and Rachel, I remember that you became very emotional, because this was, I think, the first time that you'd held a yellow star, and this was my grandfather's yellow star, and this is my grandfather's badge from Buchenwald concentration camp. And you want to know why it's important to me to be a rabbi? Because our Jewish nation was almost wiped out. That a third of our nation was wiped out, and that had Hitler had his way, we would not be here, and our religion would not be here, and our faith would not be here, and our way of life would not be here, and our culture would not be here, and everything that kind of goes up to the multifaceted thing it is to be a member of the Jewish nation would not be here. And whilst the Nazis are gone, many other things still threaten our survival and threaten our continuity. And therefore, I felt a duty to become part of Jewish continuity, to become part of ensuring that our future generations have a Jewish tomorrow. And that's really one of the reasons that I wanted to become a rabbi. And I just want to conclude with some of those stories coming together. So when I was in yeshiva, when I was studying at the age of 18, I took the opportunity to go for my first ever trip to Poland. And that was at the age of 18. And I've been a number of times since then. And every time it's a very powerful, life-changing experience. And that first time was unbelievable. When one goes to Poland, you don't just see Holocaust and the way that Polish Jewry was destroyed and other Jews were destroyed. You also see 1,000 years of Jewish heritage and Jewish history in the old shuls and the old homes and communities, and you get to see the relics of 1,000 years of Jewish life. And my grandmother, as I mentioned, was from Lodz. Her father actually passed away before the ghetto walls came down. He died young from an illness, and in between his burial and the time when it would have been the opportunity to put up a headstone, the ghetto walls came down and there was no ability to put up a marker on his grave. And we didn't know, my grandmother didn't know where in the Lodz cemetery he was buried. And the tour guide that was taking us to Poland had connections in Lodz, and he accessed the burial records and found the exact spot, the exact unmarked grave in the Lodz cemetery where my grandfather was buried. And there, at the age of 18, I stood next to my great-grandfather's grave, and alongside my colleagues from the study, my study place, my yeshiva in Israel. And I said Kaddish. I said Kaddish for my great-grandfather. I said the prayer for my great-grandfather. I called my grandmother from Poland to Israel, and I said, I'm standing next to your father's grave. And she broke down on the phone, and she said, we need to give him a stone. And a couple of years later, my grandmother came as a survivor on a trip with my parents' shul, and when we had set up, we'd arranged for there to be a headstone, a beautiful headstone put up for her father. And there she came back to Poland, leading a group of people, telling them about the past, telling them about her experiences, walking them down the streets of her childhood, and then walking to her father's gravesite to say goodbye, finally, with dignity, walking with her children and her grandchildren by her side. And that story, I think, reaches a very pictorial culmination in just a picture that I want to share with you, which is this one, which is over here on the top. You have a picture of a number of the boys from when they were in Prague, having been freed from Theresienstadt, ready to be brought over on RAF bombers to the UK. And just a year or two ago, there was an initiative by the 45 Aid Society, which is the group of second generation, third generation, and our fourth generation survivors that maintain the legacy of the boys as a personal family narrative. And they have a party every year, and they wanted to recreate this scene at the Prague Memorial. And so there you have the survivors at the front, together with their children and grandchildren. I think my mum and my auntie are over there. And this really, I think, is a beautiful image of how one life saved is a whole world. That famous quote, one life is a whole world. And really the ability to continue narratives of the past into a voice for the future and a hope for the future. That's really, for me, the message for tonight.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rabbi Landau. Really insightful and really personal as well. We've got about 15 minutes and there's quite a few questions in the chat. So if I add Mala and, if I try that again, add Mala and Tom. And so I've got one question for Mala to start with. So we'll start with that. Mala, somebody would like to know, please, how and when did you come to Barnet Shul?
It's such a long time ago, I can't really remember. We used to belong to Woodside Park. When we lived in Finchley, it wasn't far from Woodside Park. And then when we moved to Whetstone, we decided after a little while, we used to still go there, but we moved here. Well, we've been in Woodside, I've been in Woodside Park, I hesitate to tell you, 55 years. And we joined maybe a year later, so 54 years, over 50 years. I can hardly believe it. But may I take this opportunity to just tell you a little bit more, because this was very new to me to talk about, and there isn't so much to talk about. But the sort of my post-war life in England, married life, is very much the same as all the people around me. There's a few personal stories, but it was the Holocaust really that I've always been identified with and always talked about. So I just want to tell you, for instance, if no one asks that, I'll offer it anyway. Going back to Poland. Now, after the war, I didn't go back for a long, long time. And to me, Poland was dead. I mean, seriously dead. It's like when somebody dies, you can't have them back. It just didn't exist anymore. And then one day I thought, well, if I got on a plane, I could be there in 2 hours. It's only 2 hours away. And it would be really rather nice to see my hometown again and think about the days I spent there with my siblings and my friends. And I started to long to go to Poland. But it was under communism, and it was quite, in a way, dangerous as well. They could detain anyone they wanted to. And I had learned that if you're naturalized, if you're not born in this, even though you have a British passport, Britain can't protect you abroad. They can protect you abroad in every country except the one you were born in. So that meant taking a risk. But anyway, most people didn't even know that. But one day we decided that we will go. And a few of us got together and we went to Warsaw. We stayed in Warsaw. There are a few of the boys who came from there. And we went to visit Piotrków, my hometown, on a Sunday. We were only in Poland for a few days. Sunday we visited Piotrków, and I didn't realize afterwards that all the shops were closed because the Poles are very religious, and they were probably mostly in church. So there were very few people around. It was drizzling, it was grey. And when we finished, I sort of felt very unfulfilled. I really wanted to go back again. And this time my cousin, my little cousin that survived and settled in Australia, they wanted to go as well. And we made up a family trip. There were quite a few of us. And it coincided with a trip that a delegation from Israel, people had been born there, they were going back as well to visit. So it was a very emotional and quite a remarkable visit, meeting people that you hadn't seen since the end of the war. And Ben, actually, my brother Ben, who I haven't talked about, he was always very enterprising. And he went back to Poland, not just straight after the war, but after he settled in England, carried on his normal life. He went back because he had a lot of sports sort of activities, and he took part in various events and won lots of medals. And Poland was among them, and Russia as well. And people didn't travel to Russia or Poland. So he was very unusual in that he went ahead of everybody else. And on one occasion, he went with someone who was doing it for the radio, not Jonathan, Michael Friedland. There was a program called You Don't Have to Be Jewish. And he took a group to Poland, and Ben was among them. And they went to my hometown. And I heard this actually on the radio. I was listening to it. And Michael said to Ben, what do you feel like when you're in Piotrków? What's it like? And Ben said that when he's walking along the street, he feels that his parents are walking with him. And I thought, well, that was so well put and I felt exactly the same, not because he said it first, but there is something that always draws me towards Poland. And Piotrków particularly, and I have been back many times. But originally, when I said to my friends, I'm going to visit Poland, they said to me, why do you want to do that? Surely they're terrible memories for you. Are you a masochist or something? But till this day, Poland is still very meaningful, and I continue to go back, sometimes with groups. And well, I'm waiting for all this terrible pandemic to be over so I can visit Poland again, among other things that everybody wants to do. Can't wait for it to finish. So that's really just one small thing, but I just wanted to give Ben a mention because, and also something, I want to refer something that you said, Rabbi, that the boys feel very much related, sort of they feel like family. And Ben knew everybody within the group, but there were a few that were his special friends. And one of them sent me a photograph of himself in Sweden. He sent it to Sweden. And it's inscribed, I still have it, it's a little minute photograph. And it's inscribed, Ben is my brother, therefore you are my sister. And this really demonstrates exactly what you were referring to about. So these are just a couple of points I wanted to make.
Thank you so much, Mala. It's always such a pleasure and a privilege to listen to you. I got real goosebumps when you were telling that story. You mentioned a radio show saying you don't have to be Jewish. One of the questions for you, Tom, which follows on from that, is did you know many Jewish people before you wrote the book, before you started researching it? If you don't mind doing that.
Yes, I suppose not recently, but when I was a kid, I went to school in Moortown in Leeds, and like half of my friends, I had a lot of Jewish friends who I sort of, I don't know, things change when you get married, don't they? And you sort of lose touch with some people. But I had a good few friends who were Jewish back then in Leeds.
Thank you. Rabbi Landau, you have the next question for Mala, I think.
That's right. So, Mala, there's a question here, which is, how difficult was it for you to re-enter normal life? Were you supported by the British Jewish community, and did you feel accepted?
The first 2 years of my post-war life was spent, well, nearly 2 years, was spent in Sweden. And there we were kept in this school. We knew one or two people around, but not really. We were a little bit isolated from the rest of the community. But we did get invitations from the Jewish community in Stockholm. And and they would invite some of us sometimes for a weekend. And I was invited to, I'm just trying to remember their name because it was quite well known, one of the leaders of the community in Sweden. That family invited me for a weekend, and that was lovely. And we were shown around, and it was really a lovely time. But we were not much part of the community. Actually, when I came to England, it was completely different life the boys led here from what we did in Sweden. In Sweden, we're really being just kept in the school and taught all these subjects that they thought we would need later on. And I just want to tell you how the boys came to be called the boys, because they were quite popular wherever they lived, whether it was in Windermere or in London or in Glasgow. They lived in different places. People befriended them and they used to come and visit. And sometimes when one friend met another, he said, oh, he's seen the boys, said, well, how are the boys doing? And instead of saying the boys and the girls, they always, because there were so many more boys than girls, they would always say, well, how are the boys doing? And they just became known as the boys that way.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Mala. Tom, I have the next questions for you. You mentioned growing up in Leeds, and this question comes from a fellow Leeds United supporter. Yeah, so this person has been on your website and they've spotted that you've mentioned that being a Leeds United supporter feels like a special destiny to you. And the question is, does the book feel different to the other books that you've written? Does the book feel like it maybe is also a special destiny?
Yeah, the book has surprised me in loads of ways. I've written quite broadly, so I've written about football, very much influenced by being a Leeds fan in not such good times as we're having now. But I've written spy books, detective stories, and history, throughout the ages. But this one, and it's different. First of all, it was different when I was writing it. I've never got so involved in a story and involved with my characters. You have to care about your characters when you're writing about them. You have to really sort of get close to them. And I've never been working all day and then gone downstairs and found myself bursting into tears in front of my wife and daughter at the dinner table. But when I was writing that sort of thing would happen because I got so involved. So while I was writing it, it definitely felt very different indeed. And but the way it's been received as well, I've been at it for 12 years and I've written 54 books, and but nothing's ever, and it's not, and sales wise in its first 6 months it's done better than any other, but not more importantly the response it's had, the reviews, the emails I get from people about it, about what it means to them, the story, and that they didn't know about these sorts of stories, and that it taught them as adults and their children about some of the events of the Holocaust that they weren't aware of. And I feel good about it. I feel like I got a lot of help from Trevor and from some of the survivors that I met, and from other people involved in Holocaust education. And I feel like I've done well. I feel like I've done something good, with all that support and all that goodwill that I had. I felt like I've passed on something worthwhile, and I've never felt like that about a book before.
Oh, thank you. You've sort of answered the next question, but I will still ask it to you. You mentioned there the feedback and how the book's been received. One of our viewers this evening wants to know if any child readers have sent you feedback that made you feel the book has achieved what you wanted it to. Yes,
and in that I'll get emails from parents and children together usually, and so nothing really face to face, because I've not been in schools, although I've done Zooms with schools, and just I suppose the sense that they didn't know, that they weren't aware of the story. I remember Trevor Avery saying to me that when he started to tell the story of the Windermere children in Windermere, people just didn't know about it in the area, and he felt very much like people were surprised and interested to know about this group of refugees, Jewish children who survived the Holocaust and come to live by Lake Windermere. And I feel the same. You get this response and from children as well, and it's just, I think one of the things is with the slightly older children that have read it, they like that it's straightforward and that it's not. They feel like that it. I think they feel like it's an honest account of what happened and isn't a manipulative story first. It's not heavily plot driven. It doesn't have twists and turns in it. It just shows what happened with flashbacks, and I think that sort of response is what I wanted for children to give to me, definitely.
Thank you so much. We've got quite a few more questions, and I know that we are running out of time. So, Tom, if I may, I'll just give you two questions at once, and you can try and answer both of them. So one is, have you had any anti-Semitic or Holocaust denial response to the book, or I guess to you personally as a result? And the other question is from somebody listening or watching who's planning a trip to the Lake District in August, and they would like to know from you if there's anything still to see, what's there at the site, and so I'll ask you to answer those, but quickly if you don't mind.
Well, denial, I've had one comment on YouTube putting the word survivors in inverted commas and claiming that it didn't happen, and that's one thing. And again, like talking about Trevor's coached me not to engage with it, and so I didn't. Sorry, what was the other question? It's completely gone out of my head.
If there's anything to visit at the site.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can go to the where the site was. There's a school there now called the Lakes School, but you can go to the place. There is the odd bit of building left, and but there's nothing very much to see there. But just being there for me, where they came to, was very special. But you can go to Windermere Library and see the exhibition there. You can go to the little bit down by the lake where they swam. You can see the hills and the places that they would have seen when they woke up that first morning and saw the Lake District and how wonderful it is. So there's those places you can go to visit, definitely.
Thank you. I'm going to start thanking our panel this evening, and apologies to everybody for running over very slightly. I think first of all, I'd really like to thank somebody that hasn't spoken this evening but who has featured an awful lot. Tom, I know you've given him a lot of credit. I think it's really wonderful that Trevor, you are on this call. Trevor Avery, thank you so much for joining this evening. And even though you haven't spoken, we didn't give you the chance to speak, for which I apologise. We can hear how much you've worked, not just on the book, but on the project. Please go and visit the library. Anybody that's thinking about a holiday, COVID-safe holiday in Windermere. And thank you, Trevor, for all that you've done for Holocaust education, Holocaust commemoration. I think it's really just worth acknowledging that while we've got the opportunity to. Tom and Mala, thank you so much. Oh, yeah, we can clap.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for giving up yet more of your time. I know we mentioned earlier that you both spoke on Friday, I think, to the National Literacy Trust. I know that both of you have been incredibly busy this past week for Holocaust Memorial Day, speaking around the country, producing resources for schools, helping to spread awareness, raise awareness, to make more people know what happened. The more we learn about the Holocaust, the more we hope that genocide won't happen again. Mala, it's always a privilege to hear your story, and I've been very fortunate to work with you in Poland and also to hear your story in England. It was really, really interesting to hear a different angle and to hear more about after the war and how you rebuilt your life after the Holocaust. So thank you so much for sharing that. We appreciate that it's not what you're normally asked to talk about. It was really interesting. And Tom, thank you so much for giving up your time to share with us the information about your book, so thoroughly researched and thoroughly recommended. Please, everybody, check out the book if you would like to know more and hear more. And Rabbi Landau, thank you so much to you. I feel like we put this event together, relatively short notice and among lots of other things going on. Thank you so much for sharing your personal story, which not all of us probably knew before. And thank you for linking the whole event together. Thank you, everybody that's joined us on this evening, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good evening.